How to Calculate the Cost of Universal Basic Income. Hint, it's not as easy as you might think, by Scott Santens. I'm not Scott Santens, my name is Tom Pogson. And if you've ever heard Scott talk, you know that it's definitely not Scott talking right now. I really like what Scott has done in this particular article. I think he's a really good speaker on basic income and very thorough. And what he brings forward in this, to kind of summarize it, is he using things like algebra, which he goes a little bit more into detail further in as you go. But he, as an abstract up front, basically explains, and what I wanted to get out there as its own video clip on YouTube, is that the gross cost, which is often used to knock net basic income down, is a lot different than the net cost, which is quite often a lot smaller. If you want more videos on basic income, please check out in the description. I'll mention the playlist list, which is a library I've been kind of slowly building of over 4,000 videos. Moving on to Scott's writings. Okay, I'm now going to be reading Scott's words now. I've written about this before, about how the cost of universal basic income is its net cost, not its gross cost. But because this question of cost of UBI is so frequently raised and so frequently misunderstood, I'm going to attempt to explain this in an alternative way in hopes people might come to understand it at a deeper level and therefore be less likely to fall for misinformation. The claim. The cost of universal basic income, represented by C, is the dollar amount of the UBI, D, multiplied by the number of people receiving it, N. The equation C equals D times N. Rating, false. Explanation. First of all, it's important to understand that the simple multiplication doesn't calculate the cost of UBI. The reason is because UBI is not the usual kind of program where some people receive a cash benefit while higher taxes are imposed on a different group of people, or where people receive a non-cash benefit in exchange for higher taxes. With UBI, everyone receives cash, and everyone, or at least most everyone, pays some amount of cash too. It's possible to implement UBI completely disconnected from taxes or any kind of tax reform, but it's also highly unrealistic to consider that special case, and only that special case, when costing a UBI plan. A UBI plan is most likely to include new taxes and not just cash, unless increased inflationary pressure is the goal of the nation adopting it. Consider the example of a tax credit paired with a tax increase. If the government were to create a new $1,000 tax credit that would increase someone's disposable income after taxes by $1,000, that is, unless it also increased their income tax rate a few percentage points such that they owed $1,000 more in taxes. In that case, they wouldn't gain or lose anything. The net result would be zero more in disposable income and zero more in taxes, despite the new tax credit and the new tax increase. Would it make any sense to say the cost of that new $1,000 tax credit for that one person was $1,000? From the perspective of that person and the perspective of their government, there was no change in disposable income and no change in government tax revenue. It was just plus $1,000 and minus $1,000 added to a ledger, which of course is equivalent to just adding a zero. It would be like if I gave you $10 and then asked for it back, got it back, and then said that the amount of my money had been reduced by $10 because I gave you $10. Obviously, that would be incorrect. You might even think I had memory problems. When someone claims that the cost of a UBI is simply the amount of UBI times the number of people, the mistake they're making is to ignore the existence of any accompanying tax reform, which must be taken into account to figure out what people are actually getting and the amount the government is newly taxing. So in order to calculate the total cost of UBI, C, one must first start with the cost of UBI for one person. That cost can be expressed by the amount of UBI, D, minus the amount of new taxes imposed, T. C equals D minus T. To visualize this, imagine I handed you $10, but then asked for $5 back instead of 10. In this case, my income would decrease by $5 and yours would increase by $5, which is the equivalent of course, just handing you $5 and asking for nothing back. In either case, the cost is $5, not $10. Note, to denote this one person we are talking about, it helps to add a subscript to the variables in the equation before we continue. C1 equals D1 minus T1. Now let's calculate the cost of UBI for 2 people. To do that, we'll need to figure out the cost of each person and then add those 2 differences together. So C1 equals D1 minus T1, C2 equals D2 minus T2, C equals C1 plus C2. At this point, I hope it's apparent that the cost of a UBI is a summation of the individual differences between the amount of UBI received and the amount of new taxes paid across all recipients of UBI. So it's like C equals C1 plus C2 plus C3 plus C4 plus C5 ... C11. This equation can now be simplified via the sigma notation. I equals 1 sigma to the power of n equals dn minus tn. Thus, in math speak, UBI's cost is really the summation of a finite arithmetic series. Then there's the image that's probably shown with this video. I'm not going to describe it, but you can see it there. You can also find this scottsantens.com, by the way, if you want to go over this or just go over this again with the video. I'm just at the point where there's a little cartoon guy going, "Stay with me, we're almost there." However, there's still one more important detail to consider, which is the difference between positive and negative results. This summation of all net recipients, where D is greater than T, will be a positive number, where the summation of all net taxpayers, where D is not greater than T, will be a negative number. It is these 2 separate sums that together convey the most useful information about the cost of UBI. The summation of all positive values of C is the net total amount of UBI distributed across all net recipients. That number can be understood as the cost of UBI to the government. The summation of all negative values of C is the total amount of all new net taxes paid by net payers. That number can be understood as the cost of UBI to taxpayers. These 2 numbers are identical for every revenue-neutral UBI design, where the sum total amount of UBI issued is equal to the sum total amount of new taxes imposed. But for UBI designs where deficit spending is utilized to decrease the tax burden imposed, or where the amount of taxes exceeds the UBI distributed in order to reduce the money supply, these 2 numbers will not be identical. Where the total amount of net UBI is equal to 0, that will result in every individual being taxed exactly what they received in UBI. And, this is in bold, that is the only case where the total cost of a UBI is nothing at all, which is an entirely pointless UBI because no one's after tax is increased. When the total amount of new taxes imposed is equal to 0, that will result in everyone being a net recipient, and that is the only case where the total cost of UBI can be simplified to the amount of UBI multiplied by recipients. Thus, to understand the actual cost of UBI, one must understand that it actually exists along an axis located between 2 extremes of 0 and what's commonly believed to be the cost of UBI that's actually the rare special case of newly created money with no new taxes at all to accompany it. The true cost of UBI will exist somewhere between those 2 extremes, where it's greater than 0, but less than the cost most people actually calculate. Realistically speaking, the likely cost of a UBI is somewhere between 1/10 and 2/3 the gross cost that most people think of as the actual cost. Of course, this calculation is challenging to make in practice because it requires knowing every individual's income and the tax increase on every individual, so an approximation is needed. This can be done by breaking the population into percentiles or deciles or even quintiles. To do an approximation by quintile, we'd need to know the tax impact per 20% of the population and do a summation series of those 5 groups. That's a lot easier to do. I performed a calculation like this for a UBI model I did years ago. That's Scott talking, by the way. Involving a $12,000 UBI paired with a 40% flat income tax, and where the gross cost was $3 trillion, the real cost was about $900 billion, or 30% of the incorrect calculation most people would make under the belief they only needed to multiply 2 numbers. It is important to understand that the sigma calculation isn't a reflection of the true cost of UBI, because spending on UBI will reduce other costs. People with the UBI will be healthier, thus requiring less medical care. People with the UBI will also do less crime, as we've seen in pilots, thus require less incarceration. UBI itself will also negate the need for existing welfare programs and existing tax subsidies to the degree they currently exist. In short, we can spend more to spend less. The way I like to think about spending more to save money is with a car analogy. Imagine you're the CEO of a car company, and your engine team tells you it's possible to reduce the cost of transmission by $1,000 per car if you were to spend $100 more per engine. You'd be a terrible CEO if you decided to avoid spending $100 more per engine in the belief that you would decrease your profit margin. Basically, it's the cost of UBI can never truly be calculated because by assuming that the cost of no UBI is zero. Poverty isn't free. Chronic economic insecurity, isn't free. This is why it's been estimated that we could restore that if we restored the monthly enhanced child tax credit and made it permanent, the return on investment would be 1,000%. By investing $100 billion more in our kids, we'd see a return on investment of $1 trillion a year. It is the cost of reducing child poverty $100 billion, even if the sigma cost of the enhanced CTC is $100 billion, if our overall net savings is $900 billion, or is the true cost actually a $900 billion gain thanks to a smart investment in our kids? Conclusion. It is commonly misunderstood that to calculate the cost of UBI requires a simple multiplication of 2 numbers on par with what a student learns when they first learn multiplication. To accurately calculate a cost of UBI requires a bit more effort, on par with what a student learns in pre-calculus. It is a summation of 2 finite arithmetic series, where one is a summation of all positive values and the second is a summation of all negative values. It is these 2 summations that together answer the question, how much does a universal basic income cost? That's it. Thank you for listening.